Welcome to the Liz Wheeler Show. I'm your host, Liz Wheeler. We're live on X, we're live on YouTube, we're live on Facebook, we're live on Rumble. We have a huge show planned for you today, just like I told you during yesterday's episode. But before we begin the show, I want to start by saying thank you to all of you. Huge response to yesterday's episode about the suicide vest plot, the Islamist terrorist suicide vest plot that has been uncovered. The target of that plot, that terror attack, are jetliners, civilian aviation, the airplanes that you and I ride on a weekly basis for our work and our leisure. Your response to that was huge. You raised your voices. You notified officials in our federal government that this plot needs to be examined, that we need to take security precautions to make sure that this plot is not carried out, that we are not the victims of another jihadist taking down airliners in the United States of America. If you have not already, please share that episode. You can go to x.com/Liz_Wheeler. You can share it on X. You can go to youtube.com/Liz Wheeler. You can share the YouTube link. Continue to raise your voice and demand that officials in our federal government, from Attorney General Pam Bondi to DNI Tulsi Gabbard to FBI Director Kash Patel and his deputy Dan Bongino to Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem to the President of the United States Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, they need to know this information, and they will be grateful that you shared it. Remember a couple weeks ago what Laura Loomer confirmed, something we already knew, but she had the same experience. She confirmed it on the show that when she sat in the Oval Office face-to-face with Donald Trump and presented him a dossier of information about members of his National Security Council who were actively opposed to the America First agenda, they were secret neocons who had infiltrated the West Wing. When she presented information about who they are and what they really stand for and how their goal was to subvert him, President Trump had never seen that information before. Because like all presidents, for better or for worse, he's surrounded by gatekeepers, people who decide what information he sees and what information he doesn't see. And sometimes people with an ideology that you and I don't share prevent good, true, necessary, urgent, critical information from getting in the hands of the president. But when you raise your voices, we can shatter those gatekeepers, shatter through the lines established by those gatekeepers, and get President Trump the information that he needs. So please, please share yesterday's episode. All right, today's episode, as promised, will be a deep dive into Joe Biden's shadow president, the man who allegedly controlled the autopen in the Joe Biden administration. Now, let's walk through exactly what happened here. And let's start by bringing up President Trump's post on Truth Social from this morning. President Trump posted and said, with the exception of the rigged presidential election of 2020, the autopen is the biggest political scandal in American history. Now, what is the autopen? The autopen is a machine. It's a device, a mechanical device that signs the name of the President of the United States. It signs a replica of the signature of the President of the United States. If it were being used by forgers, it would be a criminal apparatus. It would be forgery to sign what appears to be the name of the President of the United States when it is not the President of the United States who is holding the pen, signing his own name. And we now know that thousands upon thousands of pardons, at the very least, and according to an analysis by outside groups, most documents signed by Joe Biden were not, in fact, signed by Joe Biden. They were signed by the autopen machine. So the question, of course, is the obvious one. Did Joe Biden even know what his own administration was doing? He went on the mainstream media multiple times and was told, you signed XYZ last week. And he said, no, I didn't. And when the reporter looked at him and said, well, yes, you did, Joe Biden had zero knowledge that he had signed various different documents. So who knew that these documents were being signed? Who was operating the autopen machine? Who was giving the directions for the documents to be signed by the autopen machine? That is what tonight's episode is dedicated to. We will be investigating who controlled the autopen. New undercover video shows the now former DNC Vice Chair David Hogg, he has already been removed from his position, revealing that this so-called Wizard of Oz figure controlling Joe Biden to be Jill Biden's chief of staff, Anthony Bernal. So who is Anthony Bernal? Most people have never even heard his name. They can't picture his face. He wasn't elected. Nobody cast his vote for him. You didn't. I didn't. He wasn't appointed. He wasn't confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Who is this guy? Well, we have no mechanism of accountability, do we, for this man who allegedly was running the country using Joe Biden as his weekend at Bernie's patsy. Tonight, we are going to introduce you to Anthony Bernal and what you need to know about Jill Biden's so-called work husband, who just may have been the shadow president of the United States. Tonight's episode is sponsored by All Family Pharmacy. You and I both know the cost of healthcare in America is utterly out of control. Prescription drugs are often way more expensive here in the United States than in almost any other country. How is that fair? How have we tolerated this for so long? Americans have been paying the highest drug prices in the world? I don't think so. That's finally starting to change, by the way, thanks to President Trump, who just signed a new executive order to bring those prices down. That's a step in the right direction for sure. I'm grateful for President Trump for doing that. But while the system catches up, because they won't happen overnight, All Family Pharmacy is stepping up. They are not waiting around for policy to kick in. They're taking action to benefit you now. From this moment until June 30th, you can get 20% off all medications, no insurance required. We're talking real access to medicines like antibiotics, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, daily maintenance meds, you name it, they have it. Over 200 different options, and they ship really fast with a doctor's prescription included in your shipment. Check them out. Go to allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz and use your code Liz20 to claim your 20% off. Listen, the reason All Family Pharmacy exists is because they believe in your medical freedom. They want you to make decisions about your healthcare without big pharma and big government standing in your way. So get the meds that you need, keep them on hand so that big pharma and big government never tell you what you can or cannot take. Take control of your health the way it should be. Go to allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz. Use code Liz20 for 20% off today. All right, joining me for tonight's episode is a man who has specialized in background research on Joe Biden and his entire family. He's a writer, he's an activist, he's a former White House staffer. He served in the first Trump administration. He's the founder of the nonprofit research group Marco Polo. We are delighted to welcome Garrett Ziegler to the show tonight. Garrett, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Liz, for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Very compelling figure.
Anthony Bernal is, to call him a mystery would maybe be the understatement of the year, because in almost every other individual case, you can look on X, you can look on, you can look at the archives of cable news, and you can get an idea of who these people are based on what they've said, not just in the last 6 months, but in the last 10 years. But this guy, there's almost nothing. So before we get into who he is, I want to show this video. This is a Project Veritas expose. It was one of the first times we'd been introduced to the idea that the actual shadow president of the United States, the man controlling Joe Biden, was Anthony Bernal. This is an undercover operation that recorded David Hogg, who was just days ago the vice chair of the DNC, talking about what was happening behind the scenes in the Biden White House. Take a look.
Yes,
nice to meet you. Yeah.
Off the record, of course.
Foundational question for me is, like, how corrupt is the DNC if so many people knew, or few people knew about Biden, well, the president of the United States?
I mean, I think the fact of the matter is the DNC is always going to be like a campaign arm of the president, ultimately. The bigger issue is like the inner circle that was around Biden. That's it.
And I can't stress to you enough.
Like Joe Biden's chief of staff, like, had an enormous amount of power.
Joe Biden?
Joe Biden's chief of staff.
That was like an open secret at that point. Like, I would avoid him. Like, he was scary.
What was his name?
Anthony Bernal.
I've never seen him.
Exactly.
What do you mean?
He's like a shadowy, like, Wizard of Oz type figure. That's what made him so, like, I knew how he looked, but I'm like, the general public wouldn't know how this man looked. But he wielded an enormous amount of power, and I can't stress to you how much power he had in the White House.
Garrett, it's a frightening, chilling prospect to think that the man who controlled the White House, most Americans have never heard his name, can't picture his face, and know nothing about him. What do we know about this guy?
So the way I want to start this is a historical analogy. In the days of the absolute monarchs of Europe, they had what was called a chambermaid. And essentially, this was a male who had been castrated. He was basically a eunuch, and his job was to guard the queen. And they castrated him because that would take away any ability for him to pose a threat to the king. And I know this is somewhat unique analogy, but that's essentially what Bernal was. He is a diminutive 5'4". I've been in an elevator with this guy. 5'4", diminutive, quiet, homosexual man who was with Jill Biden every hour of the day. In fact, I was this time last year, in fact, a year ago today, I was in Delaware at the trial of Hunter Biden, the exact day that Hunter Biden's wife, Melissa Cohen, came up to me in the hallway and called me a Nazi and spit in my face, essentially. That same day, at the end of the trial, I was in an elevator going down from the first floor to the fourth floor to the first floor, and Jill and Anthony didn't realize that I was in the elevator. And it was the most awkward thing ever because they wouldn't even exchange pleasantries with me, that they hated me that much just because we wrote this book on the family. And Anthony's in our book, although he had much better digital OPSEC than a lot of people in the family. He didn't send a lot of emails to Hunter. But he's very close to the family. This photo on the screen here is Anthony holding Hunter Biden's little son that he shares with Melissa Cohen. So that little boy's mother spit in my face and called me a Nazi in the right outside the courtroom during her husband's criminal trial last June. Anthony was there, Liz, every single day. And this was the time when Jill basically spent $50,000 in taxpayer funds to go back and forth between France and the U.S. To attend, I think, a Bastille Day celebration or something was going on in France where she was in Delaware on Tuesday, went to France, and then came back to watch her son get convicted. Anthony Bernal was sitting right by her. So this isn't a typical political staffer. So to recap, you have a eunuch-like figure who never leaves the king's wife, who is essentially emasculated for all intents and purposes. We have somebody who joins her not just on political excursions in representing the United States abroad, but somebody who goes to the criminal trial of the First Lady's stepson. That's what Hunter is. She's not, Hunter is not Jill's biological child. You have somebody who is carrying Hunter Biden's family. So this is not the typical staffer. That's what people have to realize, is that he not only, and this is one of the few revelations from Jake Tapper's limited hangout book. And I, of course, begrudgingly got it because I need to know what these people are cooking up. And one of the revelations was that Anthony, on his blue badge, I had a blue badge when I worked at the White House where you could have free access to the West Wing. But what Anthony had that hardly any other West Wing staffer had, not even Peter Navarro, who I worked for, was a res sign on his staff, RES, which means Bernal had carte blanche access to the president's living quarters. This is almost unheard of. Not even Mark Meadows had this as the chief of staff under Donald Trump. This is new. This has hardly ever been written about. I know Miranda Devine touched on it in her op-ed in the New York Post this weekend. But Bernal was spending time with the family. He was essentially part of the family. Some of the photos that you'll see online of him, if you run his face through facial recognition, you'll see he was shopping for dresses with Hunter's daughters in Europe. This is a guy, as I mentioned, he's a homosexual. This is a guy who goes dress shopping with the First Lady. This is very, very atypical in American history. So he's very personally close with them. And according to Hogg, and we have to take what he says with a grain of salt, although I believe him here, is that he was involved with what papers got slid under that machine. And, Lady McBiden, as people are calling her now, was, I think, as committed as Joe to staying in the seat of power. And so I think once you think of Jill as controlling things or a portion of the White House, there is no Jill without Anthony. He is like that one piece and Stephen Nelson, I've got to get Stephen Nelson credit. Of the people in the States who are tracking him as closely as we are, there's Miranda and Stephen Nelson. Stephen Nelson had on-the-record quotes from current staffers under Anthony Bernal saying he's screaming at them during the day, making weird sexual comments to men in the office, These are not my. This is not my reporting. This is Stephen Nelson's, and it's been published in the New York Post. Exclusives, by the way. And so he's a nightmare to work with, and you don't want to cross him because then it's seen as crossing Jill. So I know this has been a soliloquy. I apologize for the loquacious first answer, but this guy is a member of the family for all intents and purposes, and Joe doesn't look at him as a threat. This is like, he's essentially a feminized Jill partner.
Well, I mean, all of this is fascinating, especially because we have, up until now, zero idea that this person kind of even exists, let alone the amount of power that he has. He's been described as an enforcer, as a fixer, as a gatekeeper. As you mentioned, he's openly gay. Politico once described him as the Meryl Streep of the Biden family. Meryl Streep's character in Devil Wears Prada, kind of a famous diva. Mean, very berating, belittling. He's had many complaints against him, including the sexual harassment complaints. I allegedly asked members of the Biden staff, male members, or described, questioned, speculated about the size of their genitalia. I'm sorry to be graphic. I just want people to understand.
Yeah, this is who he is.
This is who he is. This is part of the picture of his character here. We're going to get to, by the way, when the Biden White House was asked a couple years ago about these sexual harassment claims, what Karine Jean-Pierre, press secretary at the time, how she responded. We'll get to that. But my question is about Anthony Bernal's relationship to Hunter Biden, because it seems to me that might be the key to unlocking what motivates Anthony Bernal. Because if you do research on Anthony Bernal, it doesn't show him having a history of working for far leftist organizations, right? You can't track his ideology because, oh, look, he worked for Planned Parenthood or Black Lives Matter or George Soros. He doesn't have that kind of political trail. He's mostly worked for the Bidens since like 2008. And so you have to wonder, okay, I understand that everyone in Washington, D.C., especially those in the White House, especially those in the West Wing, have an incredible thirst for power. He clearly had that. He went on these lavish trips with Jill Biden. But what is his ideology based on? What's motivating him? Because that autopen that was being used to sign these documents was not signing your run-of-the-mill letters to little children like the Trump administration. This is some of the most radical leftist, straight-up Marxist stuff that we have ever seen from any White House in American history. And I want to know whose idea it was to feed the autopen those things.
Well, he's since deleted his LinkedIn. I'll start there. And that's a special. That's whenever somebody gets looked at under the microscope, that's one of the first things they do. The only work history we can discern beyond being a true Biden believer, is that he worked for Al Gore. So he had history of working for the vice president under Slick Willie. And he's essentially a political operative, but I've sensed nothing in his past where he wants to write a book, a tell-all. It's like he wants to be under the radar. And if not for this secret recording, he might have, just occupied a single page in our book and a couple of other books. But I think that the Hogg video will, and by the way, I have to point out that David Hogg's father was an FBI agent. There's something spooky about that guy. I am relieved for the good of the country that he was removed as the DNC vice chair, but for being a right-wing person, I almost wish he would have stayed. That guy's a total nut job.
Though? I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's too.
No, it's interesting because we have him to thank.
It's
for this.
So funny why he was removed. He wasn't removed because of what he said on Breakfast Club about Jasmine Crockett, saying he thinks that more politicians should be like her. She's obviously crazy, radical left, just straight up crazy. He wasn't removed for being caught undercover on this sting by Project Veritas. He was removed because when he ran in the election at the DNC for vice chair, he ran against this female. Her name was Kaylin something. And after she lost, what was it? What was her last name, Spencer? Kaylin what? Well, whatever. Her name was Kaylin something. And she filed a complaint after that said that some procedural abnormality in his election discriminated against females running in the race. So by filing this complaint, he got ousted from his position. And I was like, if this is not the funniest example of the left cannibalizing themselves with their own ridiculous standards, then
I couldn't have said it better.
Like.
It's delicious for us to just look at these people flail. Absolutely pathetic.
I know. I wish he had stayed. But
He's
listen,
younger than me. I'm 29. He's what, 25?
yeah.
Guy knows nothing. Absolutely zero. And to get famous off of a tragedy like the shooting in Florida, I mean, that's literally what his claim to fame is. It's disgusting.
Yeah. Okay, there are recordings. There are secret recordings of Anthony Bernal that have not yet surfaced, and I wanna talk about that in just a second. But I need to mention one of our sponsors. This is one of my favorite sponsors. I feel incredibly connected to the sponsor because they're doing work that is the most important work of all. So today, if you consider yourself to be pro-life, this should be a wake-up call for you. Despite the fact that we were successful in overturning Roe v. Wade, which we should be incredibly proud of, overall abortions have actually increased nearly 1% last year. You'd think they would have dropped in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned, but no, they did not. So what does this actually look like, this increase in abortions? It translates, tragically, to over 100,000 additional babies' lives being lost to abortion. That brings the total to an estimated 1,038,100 unborn babies, which is actually impossible for me to mentally conceptualize that amount of human life just slaughtered. Every one of these lives was precious. I think about my own children and my heart just breaks. Now, the ministry of preborn is on the front lines advocating on behalf of these beautiful souls who never had the chance to grow up. Preborn's network of clinics are strategically located in some of the highest abortion areas in the country, ready to support women making decisions about their babies' futures. Because as horrific as abortion is, over 60% of women say that they feel coerced into getting that abortion, that it violates their moral conscience. And yet, who's coercing them? Sometimes it's society, sometimes it's the father of their child, sometimes it's their friends, sometimes it's their own mothers. Through compassionate, loving care and free ultrasounds, Preborn helps women connect with the life growing inside of them. So my question to you today is, can you help us bring life to both babies and mothers by sponsoring these ultrasounds? You know, when a mom sees the ultrasound picture of her unborn baby, sees that tiny little body wiggling inside her womb, that doubles the baby's chance at life. It makes it more likely that the mom will choose life for that baby than choose to abort that child. One ultrasound is only $28. 5 ultrasounds are $140. Every penny goes towards loving mothers and babies well. So will you join us? If you can, please prayerfully discern whether you can help today. Dial pound 250, say the keyword baby. That's pound 250, keyword baby, or visit preborn.com/Liz. That's preborn.com/Liz. And by the way, the name of the girl who lost to David Hogg in the election to be DNC vice chair, her name was Kaylin Free. Free was her last name that I couldn't recollect. She's from Oklahoma. And this was the statement. The vote comes after Oklahoma DNC member, the vote to oust David Hogg, comes after Oklahoma DNC member Kaylin Free, who ran for the vice chair position, argued in a complaint, which was over a dozen pages long, that the procedure by which Hogg and a fellow vice chair, Kenyatta, were elected unfairly disadvantaged the female candidates on the ballot. The resolution will be brought to the entire DNC body for a final vote.
He deserves it.
Oh my gosh, so funny. Literally so
Hey,
funny.
at least she is not, even though her complaint's hilarious and probably untrue, at least she's not that. Who's the portly woman who is going to be heading up their young male outreach that said that if
portly
you're
might be the understatement of the year if I'm thinking of the
Hey, I was
being
being kind. She's a portly woman, and she said at the DNC that if you're not on the menu, you're something about it. Was the worst analogy for somebody who looks like that to use on national
I know who you're
television.
talking about. I forget the name, but it's some influencer who's morbidly obese, some female influencer who is morbidly obese, and I'm not flinging an ad hominem here, but visually unattractive, trying to appeal to young men to bring them back to the Democrat Party. Hilarious. This is the part of politics I genuinely enjoy, is to watch stupid people do stupid things and to watch evil woke policies eat themselves in the Democrat Party, not when it affects us. But back to Anthony Bernal for a second. This stuff is really important. There are recordings, secret recordings of Anthony Bernal berating and demeaning staffers of, this wasn't even the Biden White House necessarily. It was either, we're not even sure exactly when these recordings were, when this took place, but either in the Biden White House, the report was in 2021, or it could have been in the Obama White House when Joe Biden was vice president. Bernal still worked for Joe Biden at the time. There were staffers that surreptitiously recorded Anthony Bernal, according to actually Alex Thompson over at Politico, funnily enough. And we don't have access to these recordings, but wouldn't it be interesting if we did?
Well, I think that somebody might even come forward for not the right reasons. Maybe they want to make money. You mentioned Karine Jean-Pierre earlier. Now she's Miss Independent. She thinks she's independent, quote unquote. She's just trying to sell a book. And so I think that somebody may come forward with these for not even the right reasons, not because they want the truth out, but because they know the explosive nature of this guy is totally out of control. And, he's still being paid by the taxpayer. I confirm this.
Bernal is?
He is. He's one of the half a dozen. Every former president gets about a half a dozen staff paid for by the GSA. Bernal is one of those people. So you and I are still footing the bill.
Like the Biden library staff people, right?
Yep. And this is, of course, pathetic. He's on the Biden laptop, about a dozen emails. And we had it for 3 years. We're going to relaunch it. Our nonprofit, Marco Polo, had an email database that anybody can view all the emails on the Biden laptop, 128,000 of them. There are about a dozen involving Bernal, but it's mostly logistical in nature. Again, this guy doesn't leave Jill's side. For the entirety of the wilderness years from 17 to 21, which we think is the time when Joe first developed prostate cancer, or at least early onset dementia. I mean, his son said that in 2019, that Bernal was still with him, even though they made sure that Bernal was paid through that UPenn cutout. Ironically,
and the Beau Biden Foundation, by the way.
Exactly. The Penn Biden Center, ironically, was in the same location that OAN is in DC. They had the penthouse there. That's where all the classified docs were.
Exercised.
Oh my goodness. They should bring some pre-spy. I mean, so they've kept him on the payroll. So you mentioned, what drives him? You ask what drives him. It's not purely he isn't up there accepting awards from GLAAD, the Gay Lesbian Alliance. Karine Jean-Pierre accepted an award from them in 2022, spoke at their gala. Yeah. Anthony Bernal didn't do that. I think it's more going back to that medieval analogy. Although the eunuch is emasculated and loses a part of himself, he's still with the queen every day. Powerful. And I still think that proximity is addicting to him. Yeah. And again, he can't even deny that the stories by Steven Nelson are untrue. Now, I would prefer that the people who are accusing him of such things put their name behind their accusations, if it is as serious as they allege it is. I wish maybe now that Joe's out of office, the people that fed the material to Steven Nelson will come forward. I believe, like in all Me Too cases, that you deserve to know who your accusers are, as does the Sixth Amendment. So but Bernal can't even deny it. Just like the Biden laptop, they didn't even deny it. They just said that it was a Russian info op, but they never said this particular email is falsified. Not a single email in 4.5 years has ever been proved to be a forgery, because it's not. It's all real and it's all nuts.
And the FBI knew that about the Hunter Biden laptop, by the
True.
way. So you mentioned the word proximity. I think the word proximity is really key here, because Anthony Bernal, if you remember, Joe Biden ran his initial 2020 presidential campaign from the basement of his house in Delaware. He didn't go on the campaign trail. They said, because of COVID. Sure, because of COVID. Well, there were only 2 aides that were staffing the Bidens during this social distancing lockdown strategic nightmare. And one of those 2 aides that moved to Wilmington, Delaware to staff the Bidens was Anthony Bernal. Yep. You cannot get closer than that. One of and 2.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, the only insider info I have on this is that for a time he lived on Joe's property. We know the family very well. Hunter sued me. We won. We know the family very well. There is a cottage on Joe's property that he built in about 2001 for his then mother. And it's near the road. Joe's house is set back towards the lake, but they called her Mom. And they always said, Mom's cottage is at about 250 emails. And you see that Hunter lived there for a time. Yes. The feds wanted to search that cottage, and a corrupt AUSA in the District of Delaware, Leslie Wolf, prohibited them from doing that. But so they were going to search the very cottage because Hunter's business stuff was there, they believed, and they had good reason to. The judge was going to sign off. That was true probable cause, not the probable cause that made him raid the Project Veritas guys. But Bernal stayed in the very house that Joe owned. He was essentially again a chambermaid. Yes,
Yeah, he was. And by the way, fast forward 4 years to that fateful day when Joe Biden posted on X that letter saying that he was withdrawing from the Democrat presidential nomination process, and in stepped Kamala Harris. On that faithful day, there were 4 individuals, 4 staffers of Joe Biden and Jill Biden present with them in Delaware at their home. And again, Anthony Bernal was one of them. I cannot overstate how critical it is that he was that close, because it means, Garrett, that he knows everything.
He does know everything.
Everything.
And I guarantee you, Joe has early onset dementia. We all know this by his gait, his lack of ability to stay on a train of thought for a couple of minutes. I guarantee you that Joe can't operate a word processor anymore. It's not like Joe's up there, firing up the Microsoft Word machine. I guarantee you that Anthony helped craft, if not the entirety of that letter, a good portion of the very letter that they printed out and had Joe sign. It's funny. Joe actually signed that letter. We know that because he dragged his pen. If you go back to July 19th or 21st, when Joe had to post that letter on his X account, which he didn't even post. But you can tell that they set it in front of him and he actually manually signed that letter. But I guarantee Joe didn't even dictate it. Yeah. It's a good chance. There's a 25% chance that Bernal's the one that had to write the political suicide note. Somebody told me back in July of 24 is hilarious the way they put it. He said very few people have the weird task of writing a suicide note with a gun to their head. That's essentially what the DNC did to Joe. They made it look like he was, passing the baton, but they really were threatening him with campaign pull. They were going to pull his funding. Axelrod was talking to the oligarchs, making sure that Clooney called Joe. Everybody, they have one true grievance, which is that, and it's I don't want to call it justifiable, but they are telling the truth in one key respect, in that it was a coup, but they're not innocent because they hid his decline from the public. But once he, through fraudulent means, won that primary, the oligarchs in the party plus George Clooney really did coup him out of the nomination, which is hilarious. And as a German, I love this is the greatest Schadenfreude ever, because I think he's a total fraud. And Trump said it was a rigged election. So I had a lot of Schadenfreude in July of 24, and I hope Bernal gets called in front of the Congress 5 times. There should be a public hearing of Bernal, David Weiss, all these folks.
Yeah, well, not just private. What's interesting is James Comer, House Oversight Committee, is set to interview Anthony Bernal and a couple of these other. We mentioned that there were 2 people present with the Bidens during the COVID lockdown in their home, that there were 4 staffers present with Joe and Jill that day that he withdrew from the nomination.
Hilarious.
The names of these people should become household names, because it really is, again, frightening to think that the White House is not run by the president and the vice president and the secretaries of the different agencies that undergo Senate confirmation hearings, that we understand who they are and there's an accountability mechanism for if we believe that they're abusing their power. The names of these individuals who ran the White House for 4 years, many of us don't know. And it's not just Anthony Bernal. So I want to show a video of what Congressman James Comer is going to do, how he's going to conduct these interviews. But first, I want to mention Cozy Earth. Cozy Earth products. You guys know I'm totally obsessed with this sponsor. These are some of my favorite products. I kid you not. I live in these. And it's perfect timing because it's almost Father's Day. So you might as well skip the gadgets that he'll never use and give him something that he will reach for every day. Trust me, he is going to appreciate that. He gets socks, flashlights, batteries, just a little bit too often. No more neckties. Cozy Earth makes some of the most comfortable loungewear and bedding on the planet. That's no exaggeration. Up on my bed at my house, I have Cozy Earth sheets. I wear Cozy Earth pajamas. I love them. Their men's collection features ultra soft joggers, tees, and robes made from premium bamboo viscose. They're incredibly lightweight, breathable. They're perfect for everything from travel to weekend lounging. And like I said, they're bedding. It's been named one of Oprah's favorite things for 7 years running for a reason. The sheets are temperature regulating, they're moisture wicking, they're unbelievably soft, ideal for hot sleepers or for anyone who just wants to sleep better. If you're shopping for a dad who appreciates comfort, quality, and things that last, Cozy Earth has you covered. Cozy Earth makes comfort that lasts. So this Father's Day, go to CozyEarth.com. Use my promo code Liz for up to 40% off all men's apparel. That's CozyEarth.com, code Liz. For the dads who work hard during their 9 to 5, they deserve the best during their 5 to 9. That's CozyEarth.com, promo code Liz for 40% off. Okay. So Chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Congressman James Comer, is set to interview Joe Biden's senior staff about this very topic, the scandal of the autopen. He will not make these interviews public. He explains why. I, of course, always favor radical transparency, which is show us everything all the time. I barely even believe their excuses about, oh, we don't want to betray sources and methods. Whatever, you've already betrayed us, so you might as well betray sources and methods. But this is what James Comer had to say on Fox News about the different individuals whom he will be sitting down for what I understand to be 1 hour transcribed closed-door interviews that I believe we will supposedly have access to the transcripts of afterward. But this is what Comer had to say. Take a listen.
Early in the President Biden's term as president, it clearly shows that he was in significant mental decline. It questions who was actually making the decisions. So what we found is not just with the pardons he issued, but many of the executive orders that the courts are now using to Trump-proof many of the executive orders that President Trump is trying to implement to make government more efficient. Many of these executive orders, as well as the pardons of Biden's entire family as a result of our investigation, these were all signed with the autopen. And clearly from that interview, which was many, many months prior to the heavy use of the autopen, Joe Biden wasn't capable of making decisions. He wasn't coherent. We think we've identified who the staffers are. Jason, you all have done great work with that over at Heritage Oversight. We're going to bring everyone that we believe was involved in any role in the use of the autopen. We're going to invite them to come in for a transcribed interview. If they want, then they will receive a subpoena and they will have a full-blown deposition. But we want to find out who was actually making the decisions in the White House during the last 9 months of the Biden administration when he was clearly in mental decline.
And what do you make, where do we go next in terms of your investigation? There are senior staff there, starting with Jill Biden, right, the First Lady. You have the Chief of Staff. You have Neera Tanden, who had these dual responsibilities and perhaps was in control of the autopen. You have the Cabinet. You have other senior staff that are interacting with them, but they were routinely directed and told us that Joe Biden was of clear cognitive capability, that he was sharp as a tack. And yet they went after and criticized Special Counsel Hur for his questioning and coming up with a summary that says, yeah, this is an old man who really has a hard time.
Yeah, I mean, that was breathtaking. That was her being nice to Joe Biden, but warning America, look, we've got a serious issue here with the President of the United States. Anytime people like me or Jim Jordan raise the question publicly whether or not Joe Biden was fit to serve as president, people like Jake Tapper and people in the legacy media attacked us. They called us insincere, rude, just the worst names in the world. Now they've all turned on a dime. And they're doing what we knew all along. They're trying to say, oh, there was a cover-up. Someone covered up. We know there was a cover-up. The media, as usual, the legacy media is late to the game. What we want to know is who was in the ringleader of the cover-up, but who was making the decisions. I mean, there were some major decisions made by Joe Biden, especially in the last 3 months of his administration. Who made those decisions? Somebody has to give the authority to use the autopen. Obviously, Joe Biden wasn't the one that stuck the papers and the pardons in the autopen. Some staffer did that. Who authorized the staffer to do that? There's no paper trail. There's no evidence that we found that person was Joe Biden. So we're looking at the senior officials, and don't rule out Hunter Biden. He spent a lot of time in the Oval Office in the last 3 months. We know that from press accounts and from sources that were involved in the inner workings of the White House then.
Okay. So here's the name. Here is the list of the names of the people that James Comer, who by the way is doing great work. I really appreciate that he's actually going after this. Neera Tanden, who was an advisor to the president. Annie Tomasini. By the way, Annie Tomasini was the other staffer. Anthony Bernal and Annie Tomasini were the two that were with Joe and Jill during COVID lockdowns in their in the basement of the Delaware home during 2020. Annie Tomasini was the other one. Anthony Bernal, that's 3, Ashley Williams, and then Joe Biden's doctor, Dr. Kevin O'Connor. These people have been invited very politely to come and give an hour-long testimony, essentially, to talk to Congress behind closed doors. Today, Comer announces that they have expanded this list to include a few others. That would be former White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, former Senior Communications Advisor Anita Dunn, former top advisors Michael Donnellan and Steve Ricchetti, and then former Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy Bruce Reed. This is the question that I want asked more than anything else, Garrett. I want them to ask Anthony Bernal specifically, was he involved in setting up meetings with the Chinese and the Ukrainians as part of Hunter's interactions with them that resulted in foreign entities paying Hunter and giving that money to Joe Biden?
He very well could be, and something even more contemporary, Anthony could have been his go-between as late as this January. I mean, he's holding his son. I don't let just anybody, pick up my kid, right? It's usually family. And so they considered Anthony family enough to carry little Beau Biden, who was weirdly named after Hunter's dead brother, whose widow he slept with. That little 2-year-old boy in the picture, Bernal was carrying him. So I think that they still talk every day. Bernal is still working for Joe Biden to this day. You mentioned Tomasini. She's in our dossier. She's in the Biden laptop. Ashley Williams wasn't. We searched all these names in the email database. Tomasini's she's a Bostonian, very loyal. She knows Pat Moore, who was Biden's personal lawyer, who was the first one to find these classified docs in the office in D.C., which is above OAN. And I think that they should have just subpoenaed them right away. I think that this is such an embarrassment to our nation. The thesis is they care about themselves more than they care about the good of the nation. That's the overall takeaway about hiding somebody who's obviously not capable of, going back to the Federalist Papers and going back to the founding. Alexander Hamilton had this phrase, energetic executive. It's why the separation of powers is so important, that he expected the executive to be energetic in the Congress and the executive to battle one another and in key ways, to fight over which domain is responsible, who's responsible for which area of government. But that assumes that the executive can be energetic. When you see Joe Biden, you see somebody totally decrepit. I mean, Joe Biden is somebody that, for all intents and purposes, he's the guy you think of when you look at a Viagra ad. I mean, this guy's totally impotent. He is the face of a Cialis ad. And, I would love for Jill to have to invoke spousal immunity. We compared the Bidens back in 2021 to a political mafia, a nonviolent political mafia. The wives of mobsters have always invoked spousal immunity. It's one of the few absolute immunities in our criminal justice system. I would love for Lady McBiden to have to go up to the Congress and invoke spousal immunity for this. There was a corrupt Secret Service agent in the Ross Ulbricht case named Sean Bridges, who married his girlfriend. They got the subpoena on Friday, married her over the weekend in a shotgun wedding so that she didn't have to testify on Monday. It's obviously fraudulent, and he ended up pleading guilty. But the people have done this throughout our history, and it's such a stain that the first family, I guarantee you, they're going over what happens if Jill gets a subpoena. Look how they pursued my former boss.
Do you think Congress would have, you can call it the gumption, you can call it whatever you want. Do you think Congress will have the courage to actually subpoena Jill Biden and Hunter Biden?
Hunter, yes. I don't think they'll have the what I call testicular fortitude
I
to
was trying to avoid saying it, but sure.
to subpoena Jill. I would.
Do they
but
have the authority to do that? Could they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They could even subpoena Joe. He would have to invoke executive privilege. And look how they pursued my former boss. Peter Navarro spent 4 months in a federal prison because they wouldn't accept the president and his assertion of executive privilege. Now, I ultimately think he's going to win at SCOTUS. And he hasn't let up. His appeal is still ongoing through the D.C. Circuit. And what was so insane about Peter's case is that the D.C. Appellate Court wouldn't let him out on appeal. They made him serve a 4-month sentence in FCI Miami, even though there's a good chance. And this is a de novo question. There's never this question that he has petitioned to, and he will petition to SCOTUS, has never been asked before about the extent of executive privilege with senior White House staff. I guarantee you that Anthony Bernal's attorneys are looking up Peter Navarro's filings right now.
Yeah, they're actually rooting. They're probably rooting for him. So my next question is going to be these transcribed 1-hour closed-door interviews that James Comer is going to be conducting. It could happen this week. It could happen next week. He's promised us that he will be releasing the transcript to those interviews within a few days of these interviews happening. I want that to be true. I hope that's true. I'm cynical when it comes to the workings of Congress and to politics at large, and I think I'll believe that when I see it. I also, again, I'm always in favor of radical transparency. People always question the full context of remarks, or it's easier to deny something that's not on camera. I wish that these were public hearings. I know James Comer says, listen, it's more of a spectacle when you have someone question in front of Congress, but that very limited 5 minutes that each individual committee member would get to question the person being brought in is less productive than a 1-hour transcribed interview. I get that to a certain extent, but I still probably favor the radical transparency. But my question to you is going to be, what particular questions ought Congressman Comer and his colleagues to ask Anthony Bernal in order to actually elicit the truth? And I'm going to ask you that question in just a second. But first, I want to talk about one of our sponsors, American Heart for Gold. Listen, Joe Biden is obviously a doddering, senile old man. His family has abused him terribly, using him as a puppet. We're talking about that today on the show, of course. Who was the shadow president behind Joe Biden? The problem with just investigating this, though, and not having accountability is the destructive policies of the Biden administration, thanks to not just Joe Biden, but the shadow president. The destructive impacts of these policies are hurting us today. The US dollar is probably the primary example of this. The border is another example. But our dollar has been devalued. We still face unprecedented inflation that doesn't go away overnight just because of Donald Trump. And it's a tactic of the left, right? These politicians who want to control us have realized that the best way to control us is to use our money to control us. So that's why they want us to get on board with a new digital dollar so that they can operate it like a Chinese Communist Party social credit score system. It is why it has never been more important than for you to take control over your own wealth. Do not let your life savings become a casualty of either failing banks or currency wars or these politicians who have stated over and over again that they hate you. Believe them when they tell you that. Now is the time to call the only precious metal dealer I trust, American Heart for Gold. They will show you how to protect your savings and your retirement accounts and yourself by diversifying your wealth portfolio with physical gold and silver. My husband and I did this. A portion of our wealth portfolio is now in physical precious metals, and it gives me the confidence and the security, the peace of mind to know that politicians who I know for a fact hate me and try to silence me cannot control me using my money. American Heart for Gold is the best company. They support content like this because we are committed to the truth, you and I. Tell them I sent you. They'll give you up to $15,000 of free silver on your first order. Call them right now. You can click the link in the description of this episode or call 866-996-5172. That's 866-996-5172 or text Liz to 998899. Again, the phone number is 866-996-5172 or text Liz to 998899. All right, Garrett. So this is the situation. We're not getting radical transparency. We are getting some action from James Comer, which credit where it's due. At least he's doing something after all this time. What are the questions that he should pose to Anthony Bernal specifically, and additionally these other 8 or 9 high-level Biden staff that would actually give us the smoking gun, the thing that we know is true, but we need the hard evidence to prove in a court of law is true?
Well, if I were his staffers today, I would be going through the Federal Register and pulling each and every document that Joe signed, especially in the last 90 days, especially in that period after Trump won and before Joe left office. For example, the Energy Department alone gave $90 billion in no strings attached loans to pop-up nonprofits and other scam artists. There was no accounting of the money that went out the door in that intervening 70-day period. I would look at that 70-day period, start there, put documents in front of Bernal saying, do you recognize this? Use other people's press accounts to basically put him on the spot and ask him, has Hunter Biden ever spoken to you about this document before? Who in your orbit brought up the idea that Joe was going to pardon his siblings? When's the last time you spoke to Valerie Biden, the president's sister, who is his best friend and he talks to for hours every day about everything, about every issue? Valerie Biden was one of the people that most people aren't talking about, but I guarantee you Valerie Biden had an outsized impact. That's one of the people I would subpoena, Valerie Biden. There's no sibling immunity. So even if Jill invokes the spousal immunity, there's no sibling immunity. I would have Val come in. The other thing is
She wasn't on that pardon list of his family members, was she?
She was. Val.
But that actually makes it more likely that she would give testimony because she can't invoke the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. She would be held in contempt of Congress if she refused to testify. She
very well could, and that's another justification for why she needs to be brought in. A quick word on the radical transparency bit. It's one of the only things I agree with the left on, in that I think there should be cameras in federal courtrooms, but I don't think it should be live. Same thing with these hour-long interviews. I believe that they should release the video, but that nothing. It's just like this Karen Reed trial in Massachusetts I've been watching. I think it does become performative when it's live television. If you just like the Ninth Circuit in California, it sits in California, Ninth Circuit's Court of Appeals. They have live audio, but then the video is posted, days or weeks later. I would love to do that in the Congress. Tape the interview with Bernal. If anything goes awry, you can always edit that out. But this whole idea that we can't release a video of it, maybe not release the live. If he's concerned about the performative aspect, which I understand, especially with people like Swalwell in Congress, then just tape it and pick out the pieces that you want. But people have to know there's consequences for this. Anthony Bernal doesn't want to deal with this. So even if there aren't charges, this is a low version of justice for him to even have to answer questions, because he's faced no accountability. Many people don't even know his name, and that's why I'm grateful you had me on tonight to talk about this guy. Yeah. I would urge everybody to go read our free report online, because we touch on Bernal. Tomasini's in there. It's at bidenreport.com. You can read it for free. 644 pages, 179,000 words. And Liz, it goes into the dynamic of the family. This was a family operation. Anthony was protecting them. It's like, people hovering around the patriarch when the patriarch is waning in physical vitality. That's the analogy I would use. And so we have a whole laptop from a member of that very family. So we have an inside view of what they're like. I got to know Hunter so well that I could tell when he was high or sober in emails. I can tell by his syntax even. So, that's what the Congress should be. The Congress should be going through every document that Joe signed, printing it out, using press accounts to see who, if there's anything leaked about Anthony. See if Anthony ever talked to Alex Thompson. Did you ever talk to a reporter? Because Alex Thompson, is the guy who did most of the work in the Jake Tapper book. They put Tapper on the cover because he's more well known, but Thompson's the young guy, the 35-year-old who now works at Thompson,
by the way, is the reporter, or the reporter that wrote in Politico in 2021 that there were recordings that were surreptitiously taken of Bernal berating staff of the Biden White House. Here's my question though. How do we avoid, or how does James Comer, how does the U.S. Congress avoid these individuals, Anthony Bernal specifically, from pulling a James Comey-esque trick of just being like, well, I don't recall if I talked to Hunter. I don't recall at what point this and this happened. And instead of, pleading the fifth, or instead of lying, just pleading ignorance or pleading lack of memory, how do you avoid that? Because I feel like that's what the most likely scenario would be if you get Bernal trapped in a question. He's just gonna be like, I don't know. I don't remember. Doesn't ring a bell.
The only thing you can do is rely on primary sources. The Congress didn't use Comey's own words against him. When Comey was interviewed, I can't remember who was his interlocutor, but he basically said, oh yeah, I sent a couple guys to interview Flynn and basically bum rush Flynn. They didn't play his own words back to him. With Bernal, there's going to be a ton of primary source materials. For example, to prepare, if I were with Comer right now, I would not only look at every EO that Biden signed, but I would subpoena his official White House email account. And then you go through emails and ask Bernal about specific emails, because what you want to do is close out the plausible deniability window. He can't deny his own emails being sent, right? And you put those in front of him, and I think he'll crack. This is a guy.
Trap him.
Yeah. This is a guy who's never given a public interview. He's not polished. There's no proof that he has a high emotional intelligence. I think if you put a dozen members of Congress, even Republicans who I, like you, agree that some of them are sort of leaf eaters, they're sort of herbivores, not very probing people. A lot of these Republicans don't even ask the questions themselves. They farm it out to a staffer. Hell, if I were a congressman, I'd be asking the question. I think Bernal will crack. And, it's not just Bernal we're after. If we could give him immunity in some way to tell for him to come forward and basically flip Bernal. I don't think he would, but it's always a possibility. Maybe Tomasini would.
Well,
I would.
I think if they could get Bernal dead to rights on being associated with the Biden family crime cartel, not just the cover up of Joe Biden's cognitive decline in office, if they could get him dead to rights on some kind of setting up meetings between the Chinese or the Ukrainians, then he could be in line for criminal charges related to that. And maybe at that point he could be flipped. I don't know. Is there anything else that we should know about Anthony Bernal as we continue to pursue this story?
He went overseas with Jill a lot. I know I mentioned going shopping with the family, but I sent Spencer a zip file we have on him. And there's even pictures of Anthony with Jill in Ukraine at a voting center. So this guy has been all over the globe with them. I would think he's even closer than most chief of staffs to the president. That's another. I mean, this is atypical, right? There's Dick Cheney's wife. I can't remember her name. Liz? No, not Liz. Lynn Cheney.
Yeah.
The wife of Dick Cheney did not have a eunuch following her everywhere and getting involved in policy meetings and having other homosexual men complain about her. So this is atypical. I don't want to say unprecedented just because I don't know the entire history of the presidency well. I know it pretty well, but I can't say this has never happened before. Certainly,
in modern technological history, I think
true.
I can safely say that it's unprecedented. I don't know about the workings before that to the extent. I want to read something really quick. This is part of what Miranda Devine wrote in her New York Post piece about Anthony Bernal this weekend. And this plays into what you're saying about the proximity, the constancy of Anthony Bernal's proximity to Jill. Devine writes, he worked with Jill to keep score of who was with them and against them, chose her wardrobe, orchestrated her multiple Vogue covers, and planned glamorous overseas trips they could take together on Air Force One, which is scandalous enough. But then you get to this part. As Joe faded and disappeared from view towards the end of his presidency, Miranda writes, Jill's rival court took charge as she commandeered Air Force One and a big Secret Service contingent for a frenetic round of solo campaigning, always accompanied by the indispensable Bernal. Her priority over then candidate Donald Trump for Secret Service resources at a dinner she attended in Pittsburgh on the day of his rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, was blamed in part for Trump being inadequately protected when he was shot during an attempted assassination.
Absolutely appalling. And quite honestly think that hasn't gotten enough attention, that she purposely went in the same vicinity. And that had been planned. That Butler rally had been planned long before Jill. Like, she had decided to go there on a whim, right? So you can say that she deliberately took personnel. There were many. Yeah.
Bernal should be questioned about that.
Completely.
He should be questioned about, especially because Divine also reported that Bernal was intricately involved in the planning of trips that Jill took. So whose idea was that trip? What kind of preparation went into that trip? Was the question ever raised about how it would impact Donald Trump's security? If it was, who made the call to override that concern without giving more resources to Donald Trump? I think there are so many scandals associated with Anthony Bernal. We are just beginning to touch the surface. So, Garrett, we're out of time for today. Remind people where they can go to read your full report on the entire Biden family and all their associates. What's that website again?
Well, first of all, thank you. Second of all, it's bidenreport.com. I'd love to come. Well, maybe you'll have me on to go through the transcript if and when they release it. And hopefully he does talk to him. There's a good chance he'll plead the fifth. But we go through the whole family, bidenreport.com. And Ashley, by the way, is very close to him too.
Oh,
she considers Anthony a dear friend.
Interesting. Well, what would be interesting if Bernal pleads the fifth is if Donald Trump were then to pardon him, Congress brings Bernal back in and he can't plead the fifth. So what does he do then? I don't know.
I hope we get to that bridge.
I wish that members of Congress would play this kind of savage game, because it's the kind of game that the opposition is playing with them. And if they're soft, they're just going to lose. We'll see. We'll definitely have you back on when these transcripts are released, which I have faith in Congressman Comer. I think he will release them. We'll see what's in them at that time. Guys, make sure you're subscribed at youtube.com/Liz Wheeler, at twitter.com or x.com. What am I talking about? Is this last year? x.com/Liz_Wheeler. We have video on Spotify, so make sure you're subscribed over there. Garrett, thanks for being with us. Really appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks,
everybody, for sitting with us at this. I know this was a slightly different time than usual, but we wanted to have Garrett on the show. So thanks for being with us. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.